So business leaders from around the world are gathering in Davos, Switzerland, as they do each year at the World Economic Forum. Brian Sozzi had the chance to sit down with the person behind the scenes at the event.
Joining me now is Borge Brende, the president of the World Economic Forum. Thank you for joining Yahoo Finance.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, Borge, this is the 50th anniversary of the World Economic Forum. Where do you think corporate America would be if this event didn't exist?
I hope that corporate America also feels that the World Economic Forum is, of course, updating them on what is happening in the world. It's easier to decipher, but also through the engagement at the World Economic Forum, that is now the international organization for public-private cooperation. Corporations will then show that they have, of course, a responsibility towards their stakeholders, their shareholders, but they also have a much broader responsibility to the employees, to society at large, etc.
Klaus Schwab, the founder of this event, what he has achieved here is very remarkable. What has he meant to the organization?
Thank you. Klaus Schwab was the founder, and he's still the chairman of the organization. And what was so unique was that Klaus Schwab, when he started the organization back in 1972, said that companies that really want to have a big footprint also have to care about society, environment, but also inclusive growth and jobs. And I think he is proven so right, even more so when we move from a kind of capitalism to talentism. A company is not better than the talent that you have on board. And I think people would like to work for companies that also, of course, are profitable, but also contribute in a good way when it comes to gender, inclusion, the climate, environment. Then you can recruit the best people.
What are the big themes here at the World Economic Forum this year? And it's a founding mission of Mr. Schwab, is stakeholder capitalism. Why do you think companies are so slow to adopt this? Is it the profit impact that they would feel because of this?
I think there is a big difference between companies. Some companies maybe are slower than others, but some companies are even more proactive than governments. I feel that companies know in moving into a more renewable society, into a society where women and men have the same rights and all this, companies sometimes are more dynamic and progressive than governments. I think governments also can sometimes learn from the companies and vice versa.
Which companies stick out to you as doing things right?
I have to be careful in picking one concrete company, but I think companies in the tech sector is very much relying on the best talent. And those companies can only recruit people if they feel that they're part of something they're passionate about. They can choose between many employers, and I think in Silicon Valley there is a lot of very progressive companies. Of course, then you get, of course, a discussion about social media, you get the discussion about taxes and all this. So it is it's a nuanced picture.
Mm-hmm. Which do you feel as though governments need to get involved here to force some of this change around stakeholder capitalism?
Indeed, governments have to take broader responsibility when it comes to also addressing the national tools that are available when it comes to, for example, inclusive growth. We have seen that overall the last 2 decades, we've never seen so many people globally being lifted out of extreme poverty, maybe 2 billion people. But we have seen in some developed industrialized countries, we have seen that differences have been growing. And there, governments do have tools to address this: education, upskilling, reskilling, smart taxes, infrastructure. So governments cannot just say that this is happening regardless of us.
One of the biggest read so far to me from the event is the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, and it was striking, a lot of the finding in there. Most importantly, economic and political polarization are on the rise this year. How do we stop that?
That's a good question. It's true that in the risk report, the people that filled out the survey and was part of the survey, these are world leaders and company leaders, but also academics, say that the threat or the risk they're most concerned about this year is then polarization between nations, but also internal polarization in many countries where we see strikes and people are not happy. So I think that de-escalation of polarization between nations, not supporting proxy conflicts, is crucial. I think a prerequisite for continued economic growth to avoid a synchronized slowdown in the global economy is that world leaders also come together and say, trade, smart trade is a good thing. Let's make deals. Let's continue with win-win thinking. Don't then have the thinking of beggar thy neighbor, but do prosper your neighbor instead.
The Trump administration is on the ground all week at the World Economic Forum. As you look back and you reflect on the report, on the latest readings, do you feel as though the administration has caused some of these risks?
So we were happy to welcome President Trump here at our annual meeting. We have 55 head of states and governments, but the U.S. president, representing the largest economy in the world, is an important guest. We are also pleased that many secretaries from the cabinet is joining him. I think there will be, of course, questions also to the U.S. administration on some of its policies. But at the same time, I know a lot of business leaders want to know more about the trade deal, the first phase that was signed the other day in Washington, D.C. Will there be a next phase? What can we expect from the Trump administration if the economy slows down also globally and maybe sooner or later also in the U.S.?
Mm-hmm. Lastly, on the trade deal, you mentioned the trade deal. When you talk to a lot of these business leaders, do you feel as though the trade deal will lift some of the global uncertainty we've been talking about for the past, let's say, 2 years?
I think the market has reacted very positively when it comes to the fact that the two largest economies in the world, China and the U.S., have now agreed at least not to escalate further. That is really what this deal is about. And U.S.-China is almost 50% of the global GDP. So it does matter that these two countries see eye to eye. I think there is a lot of interest now. What will the next steps be? Is there going to be a decoupling? Are there going to be two systems? Or are these two nations going to find a new way to collaborate with more transparency?
Do you think they will?
I hope so.
Yeah. Borge, Brende, thank you for joining Yahoo Finance.
Thank you for inviting me.